2. The interpassive subject. Lacan turns a prayer wheel. And what is a chorus? You will be told that it's you yourselves, or perhaps that it isn't you, but that's not the point. Means are involved here, emotional means. In my view, the chorus is people who are moved. Therefore, look closely before telling yourself that emotions are engaged in this purification. They are engaged, along with others, when at the end they have to be pacified by some artifice or other. But that doesn't mean to say that they are directly engaged. On the one hand, they no doubt are, and you are there in the form of a material to be made use of. On the other hand, that material is also completely indifferent. When you go to the theatre in the evening, you are preoccupied by the affairs of the day, by the pen that you lost, by the check that you will have to sign the next day. You shouldn't give yourselves too much credit. Your emotions are taken charge of by the healthy order displayed on the stage. The chorus takes care of them. The emotional commentary is done for you. Lacan, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Although the scene described here by Lacan is a very common one, people at a theatre enjoying the performance of a Greek tragedy, his reading of it makes it clear that something strange is going on. It is as if some figure of the other, in this case the chorus, can take over from us and experience for us our innermost and most spontaneous feelings and attitudes, inclusive of crying and laughing. In some societies, the same role is played by so-called weepers, women hired to cry at funerals. They can perform the spectacle of mourning for the relatives of the deceased, who can devote their time to more profitable endeavors, like dividing the inheritance. Something similar happens with the prayer wheels of Tibet. I attach a piece of paper with the prayer written on it to the wheel, turn it around mechanically, or, even more practically, let the wind or water turn it round, and the wheel is praying for me. As the Stalinists have put it, objectively I am praying, even if my thoughts are occupied with the most obscene sexual fantasies. To dispel the illusion that such things can happen only in primitive societies, think about the canned laughter on a TV show, when the reaction of laughter to a comic scene is included in the soundtrack itself. Even if I do not laugh, but simply stare at the screen, tired after a hard day's work, I nonetheless feel relieved after the show, as if the soundtrack has done the laughing for me. To properly grasp this strange process, one should supplement the fashionable notion of interactivity with its uncanny double, interpassivity. It is commonplace to emphasize how, with new electronic media, the passive consumption of a text or a work of art is over. I no longer merely stare at the screen, I increasingly interact with it, entering into a dialogic relationship with it, from choosing the programs, through participating in debates in a virtual community, to directly determining the outcome of the plot in so-called interactive narratives. Those who praise the democratic potential of the new media generally focus on precisely these features, on how cyberspace opens up the chance for a large majority of people to break out of the role of the passive observer, following a spectacle staged by others, and to participate actively not only in the spectacle, but more and more in establishing the rules of the spectacle. The other side of this interactivity is interpassivity, the obverse of interacting with the object, instead of just passively following the show, is the situation in which the object itself takes from me, deprives me of, my own passivity, so that it is the object itself that enjoys the show instead of me, relieving me of the duty to enjoy myself. Almost every VCR aficionado, who compulsively records movies, myself among them, is well aware that the immediate effect of owning a VCR is that one effectively watches fewer films than in the good old days of a simple TV set. One never has time for TV, so instead of losing a precious evening, one simply tapes the film and stores it for future viewing, for which, of course, there is almost never time. Although I do not actually watch the films, the very awareness that the films I love are stored in my video library gives me a profound satisfaction, and occasionally enables me to simply relax and indulge in the exquisite art of far niente. as if the VCR is, in a way, watching them for me in my place. VCR stands here for the big other, the medium of symbolic registration. It seems that today even pornography functions more and more in an interpassive way. X-rated movies are no longer primarily the means to excite the user for his or her solitary masturbatory activity. Just staring at the screen where the action takes place is sufficient. It is enough for me to observe how others enjoy in the place of me. Another example of interpassivity. We all know the embarrassing scene in which a person tells a tasteless bad joke, and then, when no one laughs, himself bursts out laughing, repeating, "That was funny," or some such remark. That is to say, acts out himself the expected reaction of the audience. The situation here is similar to, but nonetheless different from, that of canned laughter. The agent who laughs in our place, i.e., through whom we, the bored and embarrassed public, nonetheless laugh, is not the anonymous big other of the invisible artificial public, but the teller of the joke himself. His compulsive laughter is similar to those sounds like "oops" that we feel obliged to utter when we stumble or do something stupid. The mystery of this last case is that it is also possible for another person who merely witnesses our blunder to say "oops" for us, and it works. The function of the oops is to enact the symbolic registration of the stupid stumbling. The virtual big other has to be informed about it. Recall the typical tricky situation in which all the people in a closed group know some dirty detail, and they also know that all the others know it. But when one of them inadvertently blurts out this detail, they nonetheless all feel embarrassed. Why? If no one learned anything new, why do they all feel embarrassed? Because they can no longer pretend that, act as if, they do not know it. In other words, because now the big other knows it. Therein resides the lesson of Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes. One should never underestimate the power of appearances. Sometimes, when we inadvertently disturb the appearance, the thing itself behind appearance also falls apart. This interpassivity is the opposite of Hegel's notion of List der Vernunft, cunning of reason, where I am active through the other. I can remain passive, sitting comfortably in the background, while the other does it for me. Instead of hitting the metal with a hammer, the machine can do it for me. Instead of turning the mill wheel myself, water can do it. I achieve my goal by way of interposing between me and the object on which I work, another natural object. The same can happen at the interpersonal level. Instead of directly attacking my enemy, I instigate a fight between him and another person, so that I can comfortably observe the two of them destroying each other. This is how, for Hegel, the absolute idea reigns throughout history. It remains outside of the conflict, letting human passions do the work for it in their mutual struggles. The historical necessity of the passage from republic to empire in ancient Rome realized itself by using as its instrument Julius Caesar's passions and ambitions. In the case of interpassivity, on the contrary, I am passive through the other. I concede to the other the passive aspect, enjoying, of my experience, while I can remain actively engaged. I can continue to work in the evening, while the VCR passively enjoys for me. I can make financial arrangements for the deceased's fortune, while the weepers mourn for me. This brings us to the notion of false activity. People do not only act in order to change something, they can also act in order to prevent something from happening, so that nothing will change. Therein resides the typical strategy of the obsessional neurotic. He is frantically active in order to prevent the real thing from happening. Say, in a group situation in which some tension threatens to explode, the obsessional talks all the time in order to prevent the awkward moment of silence that would compel the participants to openly confront the underlying tension. In psychoanalytic treatment, obsessional neurotics talk constantly, inundating the analyst with anecdotes, dreams, insights. Their incessant activity is sustained by the underlying fear that if they stop talking for a moment, the analyst will ask them the question that truly matters. In other words, they talk in order to keep the analyst still. Even in much of today's progressive politics, the danger is not passivity, but pseudo-activity. the urge to be active and to participate. People intervene all the time, attempting to do something. Academics participate in meaningless debates. The truly difficult thing is to step back and withdraw from it. Those in power often prefer even a critical participation to silence, just to engage us in a dialogue to make sure that our ominous passivity is broken. Against such an interpassive mode, in which we are active all the time to make sure that nothing will really change, the first truly critical step is to withdraw into passivity and to refuse to participate. This first step clears the ground for a true activity, for an act that will effectively change the coordinates of the scene. Something akin to this false activity is encountered in the Protestant notion of predestination. The paradox of predestination is that the theology which claims that our fate is determined in advance and that our redemption does not depend on our acts served as the legitimization of capitalism, the social system that triggered the most frantic productive activity in the history of humanity. The very fact that things are decided in advance, that our attitude to fate is that of a passive victim, prompts us to engage in incessant frenetic activity. We act all the time in order to sustain the big others, in this case God's, fixity. Such a displacement of our most intimate feelings and attitudes onto some figure of the other is at the very core of Lacan's notion of the big other. It can affect not only feelings, but also beliefs and knowledge. The other can also believe and know for me. In order to designate this displacement of the subject's knowledge onto another, Lacan coined the notion of the subject supposed to know. In the TV series Columbo, the crime, the act of murder, is shown in detail in advance, so that the riddle to be solved is not who done it, but how the detective will establish the link between the deceitful surface, the manifest content of the crime scene, to use the term from Freud's theory of dreams, and the truth about the crime, its latent thought, how he will prove to the culprit his or her guilt. The success of Columbo attests to the fact that the true source of interest in the detective's work is the process of deciphering itself, not its result. Even more crucial than this feature is the fact that not only do we, the spectators, know in advance who did it, since we directly see it, but inexplicably, the detective Columbo himself immediately knows it. The moment he visits the scene of the crime and encounters the culprit, he is absolutely certain. He simply knows that the culprit did it. His subsequent efforts do not concern the riddle who did it, but how he should prove the culprit's guilt to the culprit. This strange reversal of the normal order has theological connotations. In an authentic religious belief, I first believe in God, and then, on the ground of my belief, become susceptible to the proofs of the truth of my faith. Here, too, Columbo first knows with a mysterious, but nonetheless absolutely infallible certainty who did it, and then, on the basis of this inexplicable knowledge, proceeds to gather proofs. In a slightly different way, this is how the psychoanalyst, as the subject supposed to know, functions in the treatment. Once the patient is engaged in the treatment, he has the same absolute certainty that the analyst knows his secret, which only means that the patient is, a priori, guilty of hiding a secret, that there is a secret meaning to be drawn from his acts. The analyst is not an empiricist, probing the patient with different hypotheses, searching for proofs. Instead, he embodies the absolute certainty, which Lacan compares to the certainty of Descartes' cogito ergo sum, of the patient's unconscious desire. For Lacan, this strange transposition of what I already know in my unconscious onto the figure of the analyst is at the core of the phenomenon of transference in the treatment. I can only arrive at the unconscious meaning of my symptoms if I presuppose that the analyst already knows their meaning. The difference between Freud and Lacan is that, while Freud focused on the psychic dynamics of transference as an intersubjective relationship, the patient transfers onto the figure of the analyst his feelings about his father, so that when he seems to talk about the analyst, he really talks about his father. Lacan extrapolated from the empirical wealth of transferential phenomena the formal structure of the presupposed meaning. The more general rule that transference exemplifies is that Often, the invention of some new content can only occur in the illusory form of returning to the past original truth. To return to the subject of Protestantism, Luther accomplished the greatest revolution in the history of Christianity, thinking that he was merely unearthing the truth obfuscated by centuries of Catholic degeneration. The same goes for national revival. When ethnic groups constitute themselves as nation-states, they commonly formulate this constitution as returning to ancient and forgotten ethnic roots. What they are not aware of is how their return to constitutes the very object to which it returns. In the very act of returning to tradition, they are inventing it. As every historian knows, Scottish kilts, in the form they are known today, were invented in the course of the 19th century. What many readers of Lacan fail to notice is how the figure of the subject supposed to know is a secondary phenomenon, an exception, something that emerges against the more fundamental background of the subject supposed to believe, which is the constitutive feature of the symbolic order. According to a well-known anthropological anecdote, the primitives to whom certain superstitious beliefs were attributed, that they descended from a fish or from a bird, for example, when directly asked about these beliefs, answered, "Of course not. I'm not that stupid. But I have been told that some of our ancestors actually did believe that." In short, they transferred their belief onto another. Are we not doing the same with our children? We go through the ritual of Santa Claus, since our children are supposed to believe in it, and we do not want to disappoint them. They pretend to believe so as not to disappoint us, and our belief in their naivety, and to get presents, of course. Is not this need to find another who really believes also that which propels us in our need to stigmatize the other as a religious or ethnic fundamentalist? In an uncanny way, some beliefs always seem to function at a distance. In order for the belief to function, there has to be some ultimate guarantor of it, some true believer. Yet this guarantor is always deferred, displaced, never present in person. How then is belief possible? How is the vicious cycle of deferred belief cut short? The point, of course, is that for the belief to be operative, the subject who directly believes need not exist at all. It is enough precisely to presuppose his existence, to believe in it, either in the guise of the mythological founding figure, who is not part of our reality, or in the guise of the impersonal actor, the unspecified agent. They say that. It is said that. This, at least, seems to be the predominant status of beliefs today, in our era, that claims for itself the title post-ideological. Niels Bohr, who would aptly reply to Einstein's "God doesn't play dice, don't tell God what to do," also provided the perfect example of how a fetishist disavowal of belief works in ideology. Seeing a horseshoe on Bohr's door, a surprised visitor remarked that he didn't believe in the superstition that it brought luck. Bohr snapped back, "I don't believe in it either. I have it there because I was told that it also works if one does not believe in it." Perhaps this is why culture is emerging as the central life world category. With regard to religion, we no longer really believe. We just follow various religious rituals and behaviors as part of a respect for the lifestyle of the community we belong to. Non-believing Jews may obey kosher rules out of respect for tradition. I do not really believe in it. It is just part of my culture. Seems to be the predominant mode of the displaced belief, characteristic of our times. Culture is the name for all those things we practice without really believing in them, without taking them quite seriously. This is why we dismiss fundamentalist believers as barbarians, as anti-cultural, as a threat to culture. They dare to take their beliefs seriously. It may seem that we are dealing here with the phenomenon described long ago by Blaise Pascal in his advice to non-believers who would like to believe but cannot bring themselves to accomplish the leap of faith. Kneel down, pray, act as if you believe, and belief will come by itself. Or, as Alcoholics Anonymous put it more succinctly today, fake it until you make it. Today, however, in our fidelity to a cultural lifestyle, we turn Pascal's logic around. You believe too much, too directly. You find your belief too oppressing in its raw immediacy. Then kneel down, act as if you believe, and you will get rid of your belief. You will no longer have to believe yourself, since your belief will be objectified in your act of praying. That is to say, what if one kneels down and prays, not so much so as to embrace one's own beliefs, but instead to get rid of them, of their intrusion, to secure a breathing space? To believe directly, without mediation, is an oppressive burden which, happily, can be offloaded onto another by the practice of a ritual. This brings us to the next feature of the symbolic order, its non-psychological character. When I believe through another, or have my beliefs externalized in the ritual I mechanically follow, when I laugh by means of canned laughter, or do the work of mourning through weepers, then I accomplish a task that concerns my inner feelings and beliefs without really mobilizing these inner states. Therein resides the enigmatic status of what we call politeness. When, upon meeting an acquaintance, I stick out my hand and say, "Good to see you. How are you today?" It is clear to us both that I am not completely serious. If my acquaintance suspects that I am genuinely interested, he may even feel unpleasantly surprised, as though I were aiming at something too intimate and none of my business. Or to paraphrase the old Freudian joke, why are you saying you're glad to see me when you're really glad to see me? Yet it would still be wrong to designate my act as hypocritical, since in another way I do mean it. The polite exchange renews a kind of pact between the two of us. Likewise, I do sincerely laugh through canned laughter. The proof is the fact that effectively I do feel relieved. What this means is that the emotions I perform through the mask, the false persona that I adopt, can in a strange way be more authentic and truthful than what I assume that I feel in myself. When I construct a false image of myself which stands for me in a virtual community in which I participate, in sexual games, for example, a shy man often assumes the screen persona of an attractive, promiscuous woman. The emotions I feel and feign as part of my screen persona are not simply false. Although what I count as my true self does not feel them, they are nonetheless, in a sense, true. Suppose that, deep down, I am a sadistic pervert who dreams of beating up other men and raping women. In my real-life interaction with other people, I am not allowed to express this true self, so I adopt a more humble and polite persona. In this case, doesn't it follow that my true self is much closer to what I adopt as a fictional screen persona, while the self of my real-life interactions is a mask? Paradoxically, it is the very fact that I am aware that, in cyberspace, I move within a fiction that allows me to express my true self there. This is what, among other things, Lacan means when he claims that truth has the structure of a fiction. This fictional status of truth also allows us to delineate succinctly what is false about reality TV shows. The life we get in them is as real as decaf coffee. In short, even if these shows are for real, people still act in them. They simply play themselves. The standard disclaimer in a novel: the characters in this text are a fiction. Any resemblance to real-life characters is purely accidental, holds also for the participants of reality soaps. What we see there are fictional characters, even if they play themselves for real. The best comment on reality TV is the ironic version of this disclaimer recently used by a Slovene author. All characters in the following narrative are fictional, not real. But so are the characters of most of the people I know in real life, so this disclaimer doesn't amount to much. In one of the Marx Brothers films, Groucho, when caught in a lie, answers angrily, "Who are you going to believe, your eyes or my words?" This apparently absurd logic renders perfectly the functioning of the symbolic order in which the social mask matters more than the direct reality of the individual who wears it. This functioning involves the structure of what Freud called fetishist disavowal. I know very well that things are the way I see them, that the person in front of me is a corrupted weakling, but I nonetheless treat him respectfully, since he wears the insignia of a judge, so that when he speaks, it is the law itself that speaks through him. So, in a way, I do believe his words, and not my eyes. This is where the cynic, who believes only hard facts, falls short. When a judge speaks, there is, in a way, more truth in his words, the words of the institution of the law, than in the direct reality of the person of that judge. If one limits oneself to what one sees, one simply misses the point. This paradox is what Lacan aims at with his Les non-dupes airs, Those in the know are in error. Those who do not let themselves be caught in the symbolic fiction, who continue to believe their own eyes, are the most in error. What is missed by the cynic who believes only his eyes is the efficiency of the symbolic fiction, the way this fiction structures our reality. A corrupt priest who preaches about virtue may be a hypocrite, but if people endow his words with the authority of the church, it may prompt them to do good deeds. This gap between my direct psychological identity and my symbolic identity, the symbolic mask or title I wear, defining what I am for and in the big other, is what Lacan, for complex reasons that we can here ignore, calls symbolic castration, with the phallus as its signifier. Why is phallus for Lacan a signifier and not simply the organ of insemination? In the traditional rituals of investiture, the objects that symbolize power also put the subject who acquires them into the position of exercising power. If a king holds the scepter in his hands and wears the crown, his words will be taken as royal. Such insignia are external, not part of my nature. I don them, I wear them to exercise power. As such, they castrate me by introducing a gap between what I immediately am and the function that I exercise. I am never complete at the level of my function. This is what the infamous symbolic castration means. The castration that occurs by the very fact of me being caught in the symbolic order, assuming a symbolic mask or title. Castration is the gap between what I immediately am and the symbolic title that confers on me a certain status and authority. In this precise sense, far from being the opposite of power, it is synonymous with power. It is what gives power to me. So one has to think of the phallus not as the organ that immediately expresses the vital force of my being, but as a kind of insignia, a mask that I put on in the same way that a king or judge puts on his insignia. Phallus is a kind of organ without a body, which I put on, which gets attached to my body, but never becomes an organic part, forever sticking out as its incoherent, excessive prosthesis. Because of this gap, the subject cannot ever fully and immediately identify with his symbolic mask or title. The subject's questioning of his symbolic title is what hysteria is about. Why am I what you're saying that I am? Or to quote Shakespeare's Juliet, why am I that name? There is a truth in the wordplay between hysteria and historia. The subject's symbolic identity is always historically determined, dependent upon a specific ideological context. We are dealing here with what Louis Althusser called ideological interpolation. The symbolic identity conferred on us is the result of the way the ruling ideology interpolates us as citizens, Democrats, Christians. Hysteria emerges when a subject starts to question or to feel discomfort in his or her symbolic identity. You say I am your beloved. What is there in me that makes me that? What do you see in me that causes you to desire me in that way? Richard II is Shakespeare's ultimate play about hystericization, in contrast to Hamlet, the ultimate play about obsession. Its topic is the progressive questioning by the king of his own kingship. What is it that makes me a king? What remains of me if the symbolic title king is taken away? I have no name, no title. No, not that name was given me at the font, but 'tis usurped. Alack the heavy day, that I have worn so many winters out, and know not now what name to call myself. Oh, that I were a mockery king of snow, standing before the sun of Bolingbroke, to melt myself away in water drops. In the Slovene translation, the second line is rendered as, why am I what I am? Although this clearly involves too much poetic license, it does convey the gist of the predicament. Deprived of its symbolic titles, Richard's identity melts like a snowman's in the sun. The problem for the hysteric is how to distinguish what he or she is, his true desire, from what others see and desire in him or her. This brings us to another of Lacan's formulas, that man's desire is the other's desire. For Lacan, the fundamental impasse of human desire is that it is the other's desire in both subjective and objective genitive. Desire for the other, desire to be desired by the other, and especially desire for what the other desires. Envy and resentment are a constitutive component of human desire, as Augustine knew so well. Recall the passage from his Confessions, often quoted by Lacan, which describes a baby jealous of his brother sucking the mother's breast. I myself have seen and known an infant to be jealous, though it could not speak. It became pale, and cast bitter looks on its foster brother. Based on this insight, Jean-Pierre Dupuy proposed a convincing critique of John Rawls' theory of justice. In the Rawls model of a just society, social inequalities are tolerated only insofar as they also help those at the bottom of the social ladder, and insofar as they are not based on inherited hierarchies, but on natural inequalities, which are considered contingent, not signifying merit. What Rawls doesn't see is how such a society would create the conditions for an uncontrolled explosion of resentment. In it, I would know that my inferior status is fully justified, and would be deprived of blaming my failure on social injustice. Rawls proposes a terrifying model of a society in which hierarchy is directly legitimized in natural properties, missing the simple lesson of a tale about a Slovene peasant who is told by a good witch, I will do whatever you want, but I warn you, I will do it to your neighbor twice. The peasant thinks fast, then smiles a cunning smile and tells her, take one of my eyes. No wonder that even today's conservatives are ready to endorse Rawls' notion of justice. In December 2005, David Cameron, the newly elected leader of the British Conservatives, signalled his intention to turn the Conservative Party into a defender of the underprivileged when he declared, I think the test of all our policies should be, what does it do for the people who have the least, the people on the bottom rung of the ladder? Even Friedrich Hayek was on the right track here when he pointed out that it is much easier to accept inequalities if one can claim that they result from an impersonal blind force. So the good thing about the irrationality of success or failure in free market capitalism, recall the old motif of the market as the modern version of an imponderable fate, is that it allows me precisely to perceive my failure, or success, as undeserved, contingent. The very injustice of capitalism is a key feature that makes it tolerable to the majority. I can accept my failure much more easily if I know that it is not due to my inferior qualities, but to chance. Lacan shares with Nietzsche and Freud the idea that justice as equality is founded on envy, our envy of the other who has what we do not have and who enjoys it. The demand for justice is ultimately the demand that the excessive enjoyment of the other should be curtailed so that everyone's access to enjoyment will be equal. The necessary outcome of this demand, of course, is asceticism. Since it is not possible to impose equal enjoyment, what one can impose is an equally shared prohibition. However, one should not forget that today, in our allegedly permissive society, this asceticism assumes precisely the form of its opposite, of the generalized injunction, enjoy. We are all under the spell of this injunction, with the result that our enjoyment is more hampered than ever. Recall the yuppie who combines narcissistic self-fulfillment with the utterly ascetic discipline of jogging and eating health food. This perhaps is what Nietzsche had in mind with his notion of the last man. It is only today that we can really discern the contours of the last man in the guise of the prevailing hedonistic asceticism. In today's market, we find a series of products deprived of their damaging properties: coffee without caffeine, cream without fat, beer without alcohol, so it goes on. What about virtual sex as sex without sex? The Colin Powell doctrine of warfare with no casualties, on our side, of course, as warfare without warfare. The contemporary redefinition of politics as the art of expert administration, as politics without politics. Up to today's tolerant liberal multiculturalism as an experience of other deprived of its otherness, the idealized other who dances fascinating dances and has an ecologically sound holistic approach to reality, while features like wife-beating remain out of sight. Virtual reality simply generalizes this procedure of offering a product divested of its substance. It provides reality itself, divested of its substance, of the resisting hard kernel of the real, in the same way that decaffeinated coffee smells and tastes like real coffee without being the real thing. Virtual reality is experienced as reality without being so. Everything is permitted. You can enjoy everything. on condition that it is stripped of the substance that makes it dangerous. Jenny Holzer's famous truism, "Protect me from what I want," renders in a very precise way the fundamental ambiguity of the hysterical position. It can either be read as an ironic reference to the standard male chauvinist wisdom that a woman left to herself gets caught up in self-destructive fury. She needs to be protected from herself by benevolent male domination. Protect me from the excessive self-destructive desire in me that I myself am not able to dominate. Or else it can be read in a more radical way, as pointing towards the fact that in today's patriarchal society, woman's desire is radically alienated. She desires what men expect her to desire, desires to be desired by men. In this case, protect me from what I want means precisely when I seem to express my authentic innermost longing, what I want has already been imposed on me by the patriarchal order that tells me what to desire. So the first condition of my liberation is that I break the vicious cycle of my alienated desire and learn to formulate my desire in an autonomous way. Was not this same ambiguity clearly discernible in the way the Western liberal gaze saw the Balkan War in the early 1990s? At first sight, the Western intervention may seem to have answered the implicit call of the Balkan nations, protect us from what we want, from our self-destructive passions that have led to ethnic cleansing and gang rapes. What, however, if we read the imagined Balkan call, protect us from what we want, in the second and opposite way? To accept fully this inconsistency of our desire, to accept fully that it is desire itself that sabotages its own liberation, is Lacan's bitter lesson. This brings us back to the subject supposed to know, who is the hysteric's ultimate other, the target of his or her constant provocations. What the hysteric expects from the subject supposed to know is to provide the solution that will resolve the hysterical deadlock, the final answer to, who am I? What do I really want? This is the trap the analyst has to avoid. Although, in the course of the treatment, he occupies the place of the one who is supposed to know, his entire strategy is to undermine this place and to make the patient aware that there is no guarantee for one's desire in the big other.